Good afternoon, Nawshir, and thank you so much for making time for this risk management, making it real series. As we get to speak to a host of leaders, luminaries in your own right, I just want to start off with a very simple question. Do you believe boards that you see and executive leaderships that you interact with, do they really have enough focus or appreciation for need for risk management?
Like everything in life, I would say, Subhashis, that it depends. If I categorize the kind of risks organizations are confronted with three major groups and tell you how I think boards and managements and so forth are addressing each of those groups. The first group I would say is operational risks, the kind of risks companies have to deal with every decision they make or every decision they fail to make. Now, those risks have been there since time immemorial. Businesses have over hundreds of years developed appropriate responses to manage those risks. And I think boards, audit committees, internal auditors, external auditors, all of them are focused on those. And I think those risks are sufficiently addressed. To your question. The second broad category of risks are the ones created by the board itself and perhaps the senior most levels of management. And here I refer to strategic decisions. They could be operational strategies or they could be a basic business strategy. By operational strategy, I mean managements may decide should they make or buy? Should they distribute online, do away with brick and mortar? All those are operational level strategies generally made by managements. And of course, board are the major strategies. Shall I get into setting up a chain of barber shops or should I set up a steel plant? I have a bag full of money. What should I do with it? Now, these are the risks or these are the decisions which have enormous risk potential and which often are not appropriately addressed. They might be addressed at the time the decision is actually made, and many times even not then. And certainly after the decision is made, how closely such risks are monitored is sometimes or is often a question for doubt, because having made the decision, the monitoring is required to be done by the people who themselves made the decision. And it's a normal human failing to not be prepared to admit of your own failures, to procrastinate recognizing your failures, to keep kicking the can down the road in the hope that things will turn around and the decision I made will turn out to be a good decision. So that's the second category of risks. And the third category are risks which are overarching and which affect most, if not all of humankind. I was about to say corporations, all of humankind, and perhaps the one right in front of us, and which is going to be in front of us for many, many decades, if not centuries, is that of climate change. And I would say that boards have completely failed. I can't think of even one exception to what I'm saying. And often Unilever is quoted as the example of the way a company should address climate change. Even that company, I don't think, has adequately addressed the risk from climate change. And it is such a severe risk. It's not a risk that affects the existence of the corporation. It's a risk that affects the eventual existence of humankind. And boards have failed to address this risk totally.
Thank you so much, Nawshir. I want to actually talk to you a little bit about pre and post COVID, but first sort of building on what you just spoke about. You already believe boards have failed in some of this. There is an intent that at least the top 1,000 companies in the country have risk committees. Ideally, one would like it to be beyond those 1,000, because this is not about what SEBI tells you. This is about good business.
Correct.
So do you truly believe there's enough risk talent in the market to even form these 1,000+ risk committees to really be able to drive what's right for the business?
Subhashis, if we accept that risk is inherent in everything,
Yeah.
saying there should be risk talent, by which I assume you mean, as it were, a corps of professional risk managers. Is there a sufficient CORPS, not CORPSC? Yeah. So core of professional risk managers available in the marketplace. The obvious answer to that is purely as risk managers, there certainly isn't. I wouldn't say so. But going back to what I said a little earlier, if risk is inherent in everything you do, then everybody has to be a risk manager in the sphere where he operates. And the higher you go in the organization, the wider your risk management responsibilities, so that finally when you're on the board, you're responsible, in a manner of speaking, for every kind of risk that a corporation is likely to face. And therefore, to say, are there enough risk managers to do this? I would say it's not a question that needs answering, because every employee in the organization at his or her level needs to be a manager of risks, including the person who sweeps the factory floor to make sure nobody slips and falls and hurts themselves. So everyone's got a role in risk. But yes, if you say that because today risk is not a subject that needs to be addressed purely as a decision-making activity, but which needs also a professional approach more to, if I can go back to the late Donald Rumsfeld, how do we uncover the unknown risks? See, it's easy to deal with the known risks. It's harder to deal with the risks which are known, but you're not sure about what to do about them. But your real danger lies in risks you don't even know exist. And how do you have a process by which those are raised to the surface regularly and addressed? And there, yes, you need a professional core of people who know how to do these things, and also to how to evolve the process to manage complicated risks. So there you do need, and we don't have enough of those.
So let me sort of ask you a slightly difficult question, which is, as you rightly said, ideally risk management is part of every leader's job. No one should be required to be told that. And that in some ways has actually been the headset of many leaders saying, I run a business, I'm already doing risk management. So what's this huge sort of noise saying, gosh, there's a need for more structured risk management? So how do you infuse better appreciation for the value that a 360-degree risk lens brings to every decision making versus it being a bit more intuitive, saying, you intuitively have largely taken most of the decisions right?
Yeah. Now, how do you do that? I think, again, depends from organization to organization. But in my life, I have discovered the only way you can sell something to somebody is to convince that person what is in it for that person. So if I can explain to the controlling shareholder in many cases, who may say that, let's not have all this, is only going to make things bureaucratic and add costs, and we will have a whole risk management team, and people are going to spend hours and hours sitting in meetings, and nothing is going to come out of all that. Ultimately, we'll do what we are doing. It's just a whole lot of bureaucracy you are suggesting. And of course, the senior management of the company, including the chief executive. If you are able to explain and open their eyes using examples, every day there are examples of companies that have failed. And if you go a little deeply, not too deeply, you we discover many of them have failed because of their inability to anticipate a risk and then or to deal with a risk once it has hit them. So if you're able to use such examples and draw parallels with your own organization, any rational person would accept that, yes, here is something which is worth our while to have, even if it has some amount of clogging bureaucratic impact, or if it means that some of the things we used to do cannot be done in that way. We appear to become less dynamic, if I can use that term, or less aggressive. Indeed, if we look at the large number of companies undergoing the insolvency and bankruptcy process, many of them have landed there. Almost all of them have landed there because of overtly aggressive conduct, heavily leveraged growth, which they couldn't manage. They couldn't service their loans, whether it's an airline or it's a cement manufacturer or whatever. Most of them out there are because there was a phase when Indian industry went and borrowed beyond the hilt and failed. And if you just put those examples in front and say, therefore, we need to have processes to make sure we are not in the IBC courts.
So Nawshir, risk management often has been blamed for, in some ways, taking away agility from decision making. It's almost seen as these are the guys who will go say no to things. Whereas actually, we risk professionals would believe that we enable faster, better informed, bolder decision making, right? That's what we'd love to believe. In your view, what have you seen as key challenges that have prevented risk management being much more of an org DNA? And where have you seen it work? Where have you not seen it work? What's your sort of view on that?
I think I partly dealt with this, but I'll have to deal with it in more detail now. When I said that, if I go to my opening observation of 3 categories or 3 buckets of risks,
yeah.
At the operational level, I've said they're adequately dealt with, and I think we don't need to bother heads up. The risks that flow from both decisions or top management decisions, I also made a reference, and I'll go a little deeper into it, is people are unprepared to look at, to accept that they have made a mistake. It's a normal human failing. If I look at why those failings happen and why they are not acted upon, they're all the kind of things that any group of people acting together could be faulted for. Take things like groupthink. There's a major decision to be made. There are 2 or 3 strong voices in the boardroom who appear to have understood what is being proposed and are in favor of it or are against it. Either way, a large number of the others then tend to sit back and say, well, they've done all the thinking for us. We endorse what they are saying and we say we agree. So groupthink, our inability to be disagreeable. As human beings, we don't like to be disagreeable. So when the CEO with tremendous passion suggests that this is what we should get into, it's a normal human weakness to say, if I disagree with him, here's a boardroom full of people, several of his senior managers are sitting in the room, he will lose face. And so should I disagree? I think 10 times before disagreeing. Our own, it depends on the social circumstance, but many companies have a very feudal conduct in the boardroom. So when the Babuji or the Lalaji has suggested something, most of the outside directors say, well, most of the money is his anyway, so why should we bother our heads if he wants to do this thing? Doesn't sound very sensible. But after having made a couple of observations, I've done my job. Now I sit quiet. Now let him do it if he wants to. It's none of my, no skin of my nose. So, there are many of these human failings which have resulted in companies doing things they wouldn't have done had they thoroughly aired an issue, had they had a proper discussion about it. And perhaps the strongest reason why people don't do that is the influence of capitalism. And I might sound like a guy who grew up in Calcutta, which I did. But I have seen in boardrooms that so powerful has been the influence of capitalism over business think that people are driven, passionate, or are focused on, you used the word agility a little while ago, as if that is a virtue. There are many such shibboleths and terms that have been invented over the years by so-called business gurus, many of them academicians, and slavishly MBAs, business managers have tended to ape them. And all of these terms flow from essentially the capitalist mindset. How do I make the provider of capital even richer? And therefore, you need to be agile, which you need to be if you're participating in the Olympics. I'm not sure agility is necessarily a virtue in a business manager, and having got to the age I have, it's not even a virtue at my age of being agile, because more than likely I'll slip and fall. But to be more serious in addressing what I want to say is, if agility means you take reckless decisions just because you have to demonstrate dynamism and speed, and I should be first in the market, I should grab the opportunities while they are there. Many times companies have failed because of that. And if we have something against failure, then we shouldn't get into all of this. But if we say, as in, say, in new societies like the United States, where failure is not a negative, then by all means be agile, but then don't criticize a failure of business. But there are many societies like in India, where once you fail, like in China, where once you fail, you are a failure marked for life, and you are not welcome in the world of entrepreneurship thereafter.
Absolutely, absolutely love that, Nawshir, because as you know, fail fast is something which certain parts of the world have actually benefited from, which has allowed people to be far more sort of entrepreneurial in that sense. A little unfortunate, but COVID's possibly had more people talk about risk management than before. Not sure any one of us wanted COVID to heighten the relevance or awareness of risk, but seems like the world's talking more about it post-COVID. A little bit of why do you think that's happening? And are you seeing any sectoral flavors to it? Are there some industry sectors that you're seeing talk about this a bit more post-COVID versus pre? So what's your take on that?
Yeah. Subhashis, the last part of your question, I won't be able to answer, because now, my exposure to different sectors is minimal. So whatever I say would be wrong.
That's fair.
If I go to the first one, see, I don't know whether it's COVID that's made companies look at risk management more seriously, or the SEBI mandate that the 1,000 largest companies need to have a risk committee, which more or less coincided. So I don't know which of the two has motivated companies to focus more on the managing of risks. But if from my own experience, what I've seen is where companies have looked at risk, it is not COVID, I think, that has driven them, because in the COVID context, they've looked at the risks emanating only from the pandemic, issues of cash flows and whether what should we do tomorrow, what happens if the government
supply chain maybe
operation on, yeah. So the risks immediately flowing from COVID have been addressed, and for that, even if we had no mandate, every company would have looked at it, because this was such a major event that it compelled companies to look at this. But I think that it's really the SEBI requirement that the 1,000 largest companies, because then they've had risk committees and they've gone beyond COVID to look at many other risks, which earlier perhaps they were not looking at. And And while this is not your question, I can't resist the urge of adding to what I've just said, Subhashis, is that the real role, I think, of risk professionals and risk committees, which means mainly outside directors, is to identify the risks that are not on the risk register. Companies spend a lot of time and effort looking at risks already on the risk register and wasting the time of management, asking them to present, so how are you proposing to deal with these risks? Now, you might come out with an idea which management has not already thought of. So it's a complete waste of time. You sit in meetings, management makes long presentations, most of the people doze through them, there are a few desultory questions, and that's the end of the risk committee's meeting. And I'll give you 2 or 3 examples. You know, I used to be on the board of a company which used to generate electricity using hydroelectric power. So they had a number of dams, and they had the hydroelectric power stations, which inevitably would be at the bottom of the hill because the water would have to be at the top of the hill, and then it would rush down 1,000 feet and turn the turbines. I noticed and I asked that, look, we built these dams 100 years ago. In the last 100 years, long after we built the dams, a lot of human habitation has sprung up there. Should our dams fail, many people will be washed away. Now, this is a risk that had not struck the risk the company management. Okay, the risk managers hadn't struck the company management. I said all our power stations are at the immediate foot of very steep hills, because they have to be steep to make sure the water comes down very fast. What is the risk from landslide to these power stations? And when this was brought up, and this is a risk nobody had thought of, and they took steps to deal with those risks. I'm not going to get into what the steps were, because that's not the purpose. But I just illustrated my example by saying, what is the role of outside people like me, who are not part of the management? So we look at everything with fresh eyes, and therefore we spot things which I don't blame the management. They're sitting there every day. It never strikes them that this hill could slide down and knock my power station over.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Nawshir. Just as we wind up, the last question for you would be, you know, you obviously have been sort of really kind to agree to be part of the risk task force, trying to build the risk code, or rather guide us in sort of building this out. What really do you think will be the most valuable sort of input that this kind of a risk code should provide to managements who possibly aren't thinking about those risks that you speak about, which is not on the risk register, thinking about a bit of the unknown, as you call it. So in your view, what would be the biggest contribution that a risk code could bring to leadership of large Indian corporations? Not just large, Indian corporations at large.
Yeah, fair. Very good question. See, I'm not an expert on the subject, Subhashis, but because I have chaired risk committees, and so I shouldn't say I'm not an expert. How did I become the chair? Just because no one else was willing to take up the role. I have looked at the internet. There is such a lot of stuff on risk. My God, it's very difficult. Most of it is extremely complicated and hard to get your heads around. And except that you do spend a lot of brain power on it, you discover it is suggesting things that are pretty obvious, which are common sense. And I think the greatest thing our risk code can do is to put down in plain, everyday language how companies should approach the subject of risk management, particularly, as I said, not the regular risks about the operational level, because they're all about this. I would suggest, how do they address the risks that I said in my second and third buckets, which is top management and board created risks, and obviously the major overarching risks like climate change or geopolitical changes. Does the fall of Afghanistan again to the Taliban have any geopolitical impact that could affect the business of the company? Indirectly, not directly. Because a company who has no business with Afghanistan directly, but there could be indirect effects of this whole thing. So addressing those kind of changes timely, not long after they've hit you, and then you sit around like COVID and say, how do we deal with this infection?
Thank you so much, Nawshir. Once again, really appreciate you making time and very good news. I'm sure that's going to be a huge help to everyone who makes time to listen through the session.